This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today we're in France, where Louvre memes are going viral, but the theft of France's crown jewels is piling yet more pressure on the ailing French government. In the garment factories of southern India, the sewing machines are falling silent as Donald Trump's tariffs hit hard. From Las Vegas, we meet an organization helping drug addicts living in the city's underground tunnels. And the tropical paradise of Mauritius is welcoming back its tiny lesser night geckos after a catastrophic oil spill 5 years ago. But first to Sudan, where the capital city Khartoum has been relatively free of fighting since government troops retook control earlier this year. But the Sudanese armed forces are still at war with militia fighters. The conflict across the country shows little sign of ending and has left millions of people displaced and facing acute hunger or famine. This week, just a day before it was due to restart domestic flights for the first time since the war began in 2023, Khartoum's airport was hit by several explosions, believed to have been launched during a drone attack. Across the city, Nawal al-Maghafi saw the toll which years of violence have taken on families and children.
When I walk into the hospital wards in Khartoum, the silence is almost as heavy as the heat. Rows of children lie in beds, too weak to move. A few cries break through, but most are quiet, frighteningly quiet. On one of the beds, a young mother named Tuma. She's frail and her eyes are gaunt as she holds her daughter. 3-year-old Masajid doesn't stir. Tuma looks at me and says softly, "I wish she would cry. She hasn't cried in days." I can't help of thinking of my own son, 2-year-old Saif. At home, I often long for quiet, but here, silence is the thing that every mother fears. Tuma fled her village after RSF fighters arrived. They stripped her family of everything, their money, their livestock, their home. With nothing left, her children began to starve. She brought her twin girls here, but could only afford treatment for one of them. One daughter recovered, and the other is slipping away in her arms. Before I leave, Tuma whispers, "I'm alone. I have nothing. I have only God." The doctor tells me that she thinks that none of the children in this ward will survive. Across Khartoum, the war has stolen childhood itself. In Berri, once a bustling neighborhood, I meet Zahir. He's 12 years old and in a wheelchair. Both of his legs were amputated after he was injured in a drone strike. As he wheels himself over broken glass and shrapnel, he sings quietly, "I'm coming home. I can no longer see my home. Where's my home?" His voice is fragile but determined, a lament for what he's lost, and a quiet hope that one day he might return. Zahir rarely speaks about the day of the strike. His mother, Habiba, fills in the silence. They'd been selling lentils to survive when the drone hit. There was blood everywhere, she tells me. I prayed, "Please God, take my life instead of his legs." As I interview her, I see him weeping behind her. Zahir tells me just one thing. "I want prosthetic legs so I can play football with my friends like I used to. That's all." Again, I think of my own children, running around playing football in our garden. A universal game, but how different their realities are to the children I'm meeting here, how unfair life can be. And yet, football endures in Khartoum too. On a scarred pitch, Zahir drags himself across the dirt on his knees, determined to play. His friends cheer when he kicks the ball. Real Madrid, he says proudly. That's his favourite team. His favourite player, Vinicius. Later that afternoon, we watch as another group of boys hurl themselves into the Nile, shrieking with laughter. For a moment, it almost feels ordinary, but here, joy is always fleeting. In the heart of the city, we pass by what was once a children's fun fair. We meet 16-year-old Ahmed, who shows me where he once played with his brothers. Today, it's his workplace. He earns $50 a month, clearing what the war has left behind. He bends down and picks up a human jawbone. It makes me shake when I find things like this, he says. Ahmed wears a tattered grey t-shirt with a smiley face across the front, but he tells me he no longer thinks of the future. Since the war began, I've been certain I was destined to die. Millions of Sudanese children are now out of school. But in one abandoned house, volunteers have set up a makeshift classroom. Children shout out answers, laugh, sing songs. Zahir comes here for classes. When I ask him and his friends what childhood should mean to them, they reply simply, "We should be playing, studying, reading." Then Zahir speaks up, sitting forward in his wheelchair. "We shouldn't be afraid of the bombs and the bullets. We should be brave." Miss Emel, a teacher for 45 years, tells me she's never seen children so traumatized. They mimic the language of the militias, she says. Violent words, violent behavior, and many come from homes with no food at all. Everywhere in Khartoum, there are reminders of what's been lost. Burned out homes, makeshift graves, mothers with hollow eyes. And yet, amid this devastation, there are flashes of something else. The boys splashing in the Nile, Zahir's smile as he scores a goal on his knees, Ahmed remembering how he once played with his brothers. These moments stay with me, and when I return home, I hold my children a little tighter, because in Khartoum, too many mothers cannot.
Noel Al-Bahafi. France has been reeling this week from the fallout of last weekend's theft of priceless crown jewels from the Louvre in Paris. The investigation into the daring heist has gripped France. Andrew Harding's been watching the disbelief and shame that has dented French national pride, but he's seen some humour too.
The jokes inevitably are wafting around France and far beyond. A video of a panicky President Emmanuel Macron seemingly escaping from the Louvre with the stolen royal jewels, a crown toppling off his head. Endless people suddenly asking for advice online about how to clean antique gems. There's even a genuine advert by the German company that made the mechanical ladder used by the thieves to break into the museum. When you have to act quickly and quiet as a whisper, reads the copy. But the humour is counterbalanced, not just by genuine sorrow at what France and what French culture has lost, but also by a sour sense that the theft somehow reflects a broader crisis enveloping this nation. The politics here are certainly messy right now. Governments collapsing one after the other, a prime minister resigning, then popping up again moments later to try once more to find some sort of compromise, and a ferociously fractious parliament that behaves as if the mere mention of compromise were an invitation to participate in something both unnatural and illegal. No surprise, then, that Jordan Bardella, leader of the populist far-right National Rally, took to social media after the Louvre theft to suggest it was part of a wider disintegration of the French state itself. Of course, the jewels themselves tell a story of France's past political upheavals, not just the 19th century diamonds and tiaras of various emperors and empresses, but also the gems that were looted during the Revolution, when France's king and queen were sent to the guillotine, their crowns and necklaces promptly sold off or stolen and then, in some cases, recovered. France still talks about modern politics with the language of revolution, of republics and constitutions being ripped up and remade. And the tradition of street protest, often violent, remains an almost sacred part of public life here. It can, at times, all feel a little overheated. As one French commentator famously put it, France is a paradise inhabited by people who think they're in hell. As for the National Rally, it is, or at least has been, on a steady and impressive rise here. It's now France's biggest single party, and it has its eyes firmly set on winning the presidency in elections that are supposed to happen in 2027, but which, given the current political deadlock, could, at a stretch, come before then. In the past, the rest of the French political spectrum has always united to block the far right from winning the presidency. But that's no longer something that can be taken for granted. Besides, the National Rally is moving slowly, unevenly, towards the centre ground of French politics. It's still more or less openly anti-immigrant and defiantly populist, but it's ditched its support for the Kremlin, toned down its criticism of the European Union, and distanced itself from its anti-Semitic past. One particular focus for the party right now is the French legal system, its courts and judges, which recently barred the National Rally's would-be presidential candidate, Marine Le Pen, from running for public office after convicting her of corruption. She is now furiously appealing that conviction, much like another famous French politician, the former President Nicolas Sarkozy. He is currently confined to an 11-square-metre cell in a prison here in Paris at the very start of what, in theory, could be a 5-year sentence for criminal association in a corruption scandal. In reality, the 70-year-old will probably be home by Christmas. But that hasn't stopped Mr. Sarkozy from blasting hateful French judges, insisting he's the innocent victim of a judicial scandal and that France itself has been humiliated. It is serious stuff, adding to the mood of gloom here, of a country supposedly adrift, its economy in deep trouble. But, as with the Louvre heist, the French public remains keen to show off its sense of humour as well as its outrage. Videos have been circulating online of Mr. Sarkozy's fellow prisoners shouting from their cell windows at night, taunting, teasing the former president. Artificial intelligence is being employed enthusiastically to imagine what's happening to him inside prison. In reality, he's in no danger. In fact, armed French Secret Service officers have been dispatched to the prison to stand outside his cell round the clock, much to the irritation of the prison guards, who feel they're being undermined. If only the Louvre's jewels had been treated with as much care.
Andrew Harding. In dealing with countries across the world, Donald Trump has talked tough on tariffs, arguing they were one of the best ways to protect American jobs and industries. But what does that mean for nations which depend on exports to the US? India has been making textiles and clothing for the world for centuries, but its goods are now less competitive for American buyers. The fear of a trade slump is real, and India's government is pulling levers to stimulate economic demand. In the run-up to the recent Diwali festivals, Archana Shukla saw some worrying signs.
The first thing that struck me when I entered Krishnamurthy's factory was the silence, highly unusual for a garment factory, right before a festive season. It seemed work had stopped abruptly. Rows of tables with fabric and half-stitched garments stood bare. In one corner, bright rolls of cloth, reds, yellows, tiny cartoon prints, were stacked and gathering dust, a quiet reminder of what's been put on hold. This export factory in Tirupur town in southern India specializes in children's clothes and has long depended almost entirely on orders from big US brands. But with President Donald Trump's 50% tariffs on Indian goods, all of its clients have halted their shipments and orders. Just a few months ago, Krishnamurthy, a first-generation entrepreneur, now in his 60s, was in expansion mode. He'd invested heavily, doubled capacity, bought 200 new machines, and taken on 250 more workers. Like many exporters, he was betting big on warming India-US ties and the promise of a trade deal opening new doors. We were ready for a boom, he said, but everything flipped overnight. We are just making a few Diwali orders for local markets. It is just to survive. I still have to pay my workers. Krishnamurthy's words lingered as I looked around. Nearly 60 workers, men and women, sitting idle. Their faces tense, eyes showing quiet anxiety. Right before what should have been the most hopeful time of the year, Diwali, which usually brings bonuses, gifts, celebration, this year they're just hoping to hold on to their jobs. This anxiety stretches across Tirupur, the small dusty town that powers a third of India's $16 billion garment exports. Every factory here supplies to someone big, churning out millions of pieces a year. At 50% tariffs, an Indian-made shirt that once sold for $10 will now cost American buyers over $16, far more than those made in China, Bangladesh or Vietnam. Just along the road, I stopped at another factory, Raft Garments. The owner, Siva Subramaniam, stepped out of his corner office to meet me. He looked composed, but clearly exhausted, his phone in his hand. He told me he'd been on calls all morning with his US clients, still negotiating over who would bear the new tariffs. Everywhere I looked were stacks of sealed boxes, nearly $1 million worth of branded underwear meant for a top US retailer. This order may never leave. It's a loss we'll have to bear, he said quietly. The Indian government says it's stepping in, promising credit support for small businesses to stay afloat. And then there's tax cuts to boost local consumer spending. Taxes on a range of goods, from electronics and kitchenware to bikes and cars, have also been cut. It's all carefully timed. This stretch from Navratri to Diwali and into the wedding season is when Indian shoppers traditionally open their wallets. Back in Mumbai a few days later, I visited Crawford Market, the city's biggest wholesale and retail hub. The Diwali market was buzzing. Bollywood songs blared from loudspeakers, and the smell of incense, fried snacks and sugar syrup filled the air. A scooter showroom there was packed. After the tax cuts, two-wheelers are 10% cheaper now. The dealer, who was busy handling his delivery schedules, told me sales have jumped 30% this month. It's the best festive season we've had in a while, he said, smiling. But will it last? Karthik, a young man in his 20s, selling strings of lanterns, shook his head. People are buying, he said, but carefully, fewer, smaller items. With the uncertainty, people seem more inclined to save than spend. As I leave the market, the sky is a blur of fireworks. I watch a little boy point excitedly at a box of sparklers. His mother hesitates, then nods and buys it. It's a small moment, but somehow captures the hope, the caution, the need to keep the wheels of the economy turning, one purchase at a time.
Archana Shukla. Next to Nevada in the US, which has not been immune to America's opioid epidemic. Drugs like fentanyl have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans in recent years, and in the city of Las Vegas, a particularly vulnerable substance-using group are the homeless people who live in the city's underground tunnels. Linda Presley joined a local organisation, Shine a Light, as they ventured underground with the offer of help to those wanting to make a change.
Shine a light! Rob Banghart calls into the abyss at the entrance of one of Sin City's vast concrete storm drains. We wait on grubby gravel strewn with the detritus of human life, fast food wrappers, a frying pan, a rusty abandoned wheelchair lying on its side. Here at the mouth of the tunnel, the sunlight's brilliant, almost blinding. A few metres into it, there's no light at all. Rob shouts again, "Shine a light!" The volunteers with us are ready with supplies, water, snacks and pouches of naloxone, an antidote for opioid overdose. We listen, hear some movement and an echoey voice. "Hey!" Then the scrunch of footsteps, and emerging from the obscurity inside the storm drain is a man in a raggedy vest top, long shorts and ancient sneakers. This is Tim. "How are you doing?" Rob asks him. "Living the dream," says Tim, with irony and great comic timing. Tim's been homeless in Las Vegas for 6 years. Rob asks if he's been to the Shine a Light office recently. It's where Tim, and anyone like him, can drop by and get food and clothing. And if Tim wants, Rob's organisation would also support him to get treatment for his addiction and access more permanent housing. But Tim's not ready for those conversations today, and he busies himself collecting supplies from the volunteers. Tim says he doesn't take opioids like fentanyl anymore. He uses methamphetamine, or crystal meth, a highly addictive synthetic stimulant. So I'm surprised when he stuffs a few sachets of naloxone, the nasal spray that can reverse an opioid overdose, into his pockets. It turns out there are two reasons for this. Firstly, Tim likes to have it handy in case he witnesses a fentanyl user becoming unconscious. He says he's given naloxone to 5 different people who overdosed, and not just in the tunnels. Regular people, he says, with well-paid jobs. I've saved a few people's lives. The other reason Tim keeps naloxone is in case he overdoses himself, because he's taken something he didn't mean to. It happened once, he tells me, when his meth was contaminated with fentanyl. He passed out. Fortunately, another tunnel resident, someone Tim describes as kind of an enemy at the time, squirted the naloxone up Tim's nose and brought him round. We switch on our head torches to move further in. Rob tells us that just in the last year or so, 6 or 7 people have overdosed and died in this one tunnel. And there are a staggering 900 kilometres of these storm drains under the city of Las Vegas, with, says Rob, a transient population of some 1,500 people. Rob's tall and angular, his head shaved. He's a former drug user now in recovery for 7 years and deeply committed to using his own lived experience to enable tunnel dwellers to start a new life, like he did. Treatment, stability, a home above ground. Rob strides along confidently on the uneven stones. I'm carefully picking my way, uncertain of what might be underfoot or ahead. Every so often our flashlights illuminate some loud neon graffiti painted onto the concrete walls. And then Rob tells us we're right under Caesar's Palace, the iconic Las Vegas casino, destination of the world's high rollers. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Lavish ballrooms and sunlit Roman-style fountains above ground, dust, debris and darkness below. And here's Jay, an eerie figure in the not even half-light, lying down, propped up on one elbow on an old mattress on the ground, surrounded by his worldly goods. We squat down to chat. He tells us he's seen too many people overdose on fentanyl. Some died. Rob's known Jay a while. He tells him Jay's brother's been in touch, asking after Jay. Jay's interested for a moment, but then says he and his sibling aren't speaking. Something painful in the family history. Jay's despair is palpable. He tells us there's nothing good in these tunnels. It's horrible, he says simply. Even so, like Tim, Jay can't quite take Rob's outstretched hand and accept the offer of more substantial help. I just have no interest in anything. Where do you go from there? Jay asks us. We say our goodbyes and make our way back towards the light at the end of the tunnel. Rob reflects on our morning. He isn't discouraged by Tim and Jay. He says he's seen hundreds of people eventually leave these places, come up from the drains and start their journey to sobriety. And there isn't only one way to get there. There's no cookie-cutter solution to addiction, Rob says. It's as complicated as human beings are.
Linda Presley. And finally, the islands of the Indian Ocean have seen many unique animals evolve over millennia, from Madagascar's lemurs to the giant Aldabra tortoises of the Seychelles. Some, like the giant flightless dodo of Mauritius, didn't survive the demands human beings have made of their island's environment, becoming a symbol of extinction around the world. These days, there's more understanding of the risks to wildlife, but still many species are threatened. Lorraine Mallender recently heard about a daring rescue mission.
"There's one. Did you see it?" says Nick. A quick flicker in the donkey grass and it's gone. I'm on Île Vauquois, a speck of moonlight coralline rock off the southeast coast of Mauritius, bent double amid wind-blown trees, hoping to glimpse one of the tiny island's extremely rare and very fast-moving resident geckos. 5 years ago, conservationists plucked dozens of endangered geckos from this otherworldly paradise, one of the world's top biodiversity hotspots bursting with native species, after a Japanese cargo ship, the MV Wakashio, smashed into the nearby coral reef, spewing 1,000 tons of oil into the pristine lagoon. I've come here with British gecko expert Nick Cole and his Mauritian colleague Deepak Ramjawan to hear how they were saved from potential extinction after being flown thousands of miles to a reptile breeding facility on the Channel Island of Jersey. This year, 57 minuscule eggs made the return journey, hatching 50 lesser night gecko babies in the bubbly rocks of Ilovakwa. We were very satisfied that we had 88% hatching success, says Deepak, who works with the National Parks and Conservation Service, the lead agency monitoring native biodiversity since the oil slick. Nick, who works with the Jersey-based Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, tells me about the emergency evacuation of the lesser night geckos, along with a selection of the wonderfully named Bodgers and Bhutan skink geckos. The weather had turned ugly after the spill, high winds stirring the ocean into towering waves, spraying droplets of oil onto Ilovakwa and the surrounding islands. Just one splash onto one of these rare creatures could have killed them. Nick and his Mauritian colleagues leapt into action. They worked in the dark to find the lesser night geckos, which, as the name suggests, only come out at night. Watching him in broad daylight, tiptoeing ninja-like in search of darting reptiles in the long grass, I'm amazed they ever managed to find 30 of the nocturnal creatures, along with 30 Bodger skinks and 6 Bhutan skinks, bringing the 3 reptile gangs to live at Nick's place on Mauritius. He had to seal off his spare room, building racks and units and installing ultraviolet lights. Having lived and breathed reptiles all his life, he knew how to put them at their ease. Each species has its ways. The lesser night geckos, only 5 centimetres long, soft and brown with distinctive white chevrons, can be shy. They avoid the feisty Bodger skinks, twice as big, with shiny golden brown scales and bags of attitude, says Nick. Then there are the Bhutan skinks, darker in colour and super fast. Great fun, but a nightmare to capture, he laughs. You need to know how to handle and hold them. But crashing at Nick's place was never going to be a viable long-term option for the creatures, and so it was decided to send them to Jersey Zoo's world-class reptile facility. At that time, the world was still in COVID lockdown. Nick managed to secure the loan of a private jet from a local businessman, packing the VIGs, that's very important geckos, in egg cartons in thermally insulated crates for their long-haul flight. The team at Jersey Zoo have created what they call ARC populations of the 3 species, aiming for a phased return of eggs and adult geckos. It's all about preserving the gene pool, which will help them cope with challenges like rising temperatures after their return to the wild. But why go to such extremes for a bunch of tiny geckos clinging to some far-flung rocks in the Indian Ocean? Because these delicate ecosystems also support humans, says Nick. Remove one and the system starts to crumble, creating cascades of extinction. The more we can restore, the better it is for humans. On the boat back to Mauritius, I survey the rolling bamboo mountains, imagining those distant days when dodos still roamed the land. The birds were doomed to extinction, but the geckos are still here. Long may they remain.
Lorraine Mallender. And that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Please join us.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today, Donald Trump seems determined to stymie his detractors. Is the Republican president adopting the cancel culture he claims to detest? We meet Brazil's President Lula as he contemplates his re-election chances next year. His arch-rival is facing time in prison, but his influence remains potent. In South Korea, cafe culture has taken a different turn. A new initiative is using convenience stores to help people combat loneliness. And finally, displays of patriotism abound at Intervision, Russia's answer to the Eurovision Song Contest. But first, when Sir Keir Starmer announced the UK government's recognition of a Palestinian state last weekend, along with France, Australia and Canada, he said he was acting to revive the hope of peace on a two-state solution. But Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Friday that it would be sheer madness for Israel to recognise a Palestinian state. His government is continuing its intense military offensive in the Gaza Strip, which, it says, is to defeat Hamas. Our Middle East correspondent Yolande Knell has been to Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank to hear about Palestinians' doubts and demands.
As I arrive in Bethlehem early in the morning, children are lining up for assembly at a distant school, and I catch on the wind the strident first bars of Fida'i, the Palestinian national anthem. But up on the olive tree-dotted hillside, there's a firm reminder that an independent nation-state of Palestine remains a long way off. A grey Israeli military watchtower stands sentinel. The recent rush to recognise a Palestinian state by the UK, France, Canada and others is too little, but not too late, I'm told with a smile by Palestinian theologian Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb at Dar al-Kalama, the modern university he founded. The challenge now is to translate this into action, so it's not just lip service, the pastor goes on. And people here have lots of doubts. Are these governments ready to sanction Israel, to stop annexation of the West Bank and the genocide in Gaza, to make a two-state reality, he asks. For now, the grinding reality for millions of Palestinians is Israeli occupation, and there are fears that could soon get worse. Israel's government is furious at recent international declarations. It rejects a UN Commission of Inquiry report concluding that it's carrying out genocide in Gaza, and it sees recognition of a Palestinian state by Israeli allies as rewarding terrorism. In retaliation, Israel's far-right ministers want the West Bank, which Palestinians claim for their own state, along with East Jerusalem and Gaza, to be annexed. Already de facto annexations here, Reverend Dr. Mitri argues. What they're asking for now is de jure, or rightful entitlement. He points out that Palestinians have no control over their own borders and expresses frustration about Israel's recent closure of the Allenby Bridge crossing with Jordan. The crossing was initially shut after a Jordanian lorry driver killed 2 Israeli soldiers there earlier this month. But then Israel's political leaders ordered it closed. For much of the past week, it was nearly impossible for West Bank Palestinians to enter and exit the territory. And since the Gaza war, movements within the West Bank have become even more difficult, as well as the Israeli checkpoints and separation barrier which cut off access to neighbouring Jerusalem. There are more than 50 iron gates in the Bethlehem area, which the Israeli army can shut without notice, citing security reasons. It's like we live in a prison, says Bethlehem's deputy mayor, Lucy Talgier. I meet her in her smart office. It was recently renovated with foreign donor money, but now, she says, funds are in worryingly short supply. It's a catastrophe when it comes to the economy, Miss Talgier exclaims. From her balcony, we look down at the street cleaners and police officers in Manger Square who've been getting only partial salaries. The Palestinian Authority relies on tax revenues collected by Israel, which it's withholding. Israel says that's because the authority makes payments to prisoners that incentivise attacks on Israelis. The Palestinians say they've cancelled those and changed their welfare system. It's not just government funds that are low. Since the deadly Hamas-led attacks nearly 2 years ago, Palestinian labourers in the West Bank have been blocked from entering Israel for work, and the war puts off foreign visitors. In Bethlehem, we depend totally on tourism, Ms. Talgier explains. Without it, unemployment's skyrocketing. As much as Palestinians crave an independent state of their own, the obstacles they face in the West Bank are increasingly visible. On a winding road to Bethlehem in a UNESCO World Heritage Site near the village of Batir, more white cabins belonging to Israeli settlers have recently popped up. The settlers set up a farm on the land of Ghassan Olian without even securing Israeli authorization. Now Ghassan says it's simply too dangerous for us to go back. According to 2 Israeli NGOs, there are currently more than 100 such illegal farming outposts, giving extremist settlers effective control of 14% of the West Bank. Ghassan has other problems too. One night in January, Israeli soldiers raided his house and arrested his son. He's now among 11,000 Palestinians classed as Israeli security prisoners, and one of more than 3,000 being held without trial or charge. Still, Ghassan reminds me, in this state of ours, there are many Palestinians suffering even more. And back in Manger Square, a small band of local Palestinian protesters want to remind everyone of that. We're all Gaza, we're all Palestine, their banners read. One demonstrator tells me he wants to feel hopeful that the Palestinian nationalist cause is finally on the international agenda. But, he says, that will count for nothing if Gaza and its people can't be saved.
Yolande Nell. At the United Nations General Assembly this week, Donald Trump took to the stage and gave a scathing speech that took aim at the body itself. He claimed UN predictions on climate change were wrong and criticised its assistance of asylum seekers, saying it was funding an assault on Western countries. While Mr. Trump tried to reconcile his comments after meeting with the UN Secretary-General, saying the US was behind the UN 100%, it was another example of how Mr. Trump has never been shy in attacking political opponents, a trend that seems to have stepped up a gear since he returned to the White House, says Anthony Zerka in Washington.
If the first 8 months of Donald Trump's second White House term have seemed like a blur, the past 3 weeks have been careening along at a breakneck pace. The force with which the president has been wielding newfound executive authority has been truly remarkable. He has deployed National Guard troops on the streets of American cities, encouraged investigations of political opponents, and filed a multi-billion-dollar defamation suit against the New York Times. Trump's moves have been conducted with a kind of open zeal, brazenness, his critics might say, that could belie how dramatic they are. His Saturday night Truth Social post demanding that his Justice Department prosecute a handful of named political opponents, for instance, is the kind of thing that, when discussed in private and revealed in Oval Office recordings a half-century ago, prompted a bipartisan outcry that culminated in Richard Nixon's resignation as president. Now, it's just a blip in the weekly news cycle. Punctuating all this have been moments of jarring political violence. the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk in Utah 2 weeks ago, and Wednesday's shooting at an immigration detention facility in Texas. Those incidents have prompted administration promises of new crackdowns on left-wing organizations and a campaign to punish what it says is toxic political speech. Late-night host Jimmy Kimmel, for instance, was temporarily taken off the air following threats from the White House because of comments he made in the wake of Kirk's murder. These sorts of developments have many on the left accusing Donald Trump of moving the nation toward authoritarianism and even fascism. Some have drawn dark comparisons to Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany in the 1930s. When the president went out to dinner here in Washington, D.C. earlier this month, protesters in the restaurant chanted, "Trump is the Hitler of our time." The White House and quite a few conservative commentators have responded that such accusations are absurd. They not only ignore what they say were similar actions taken during the Biden presidency, including prosecutions targeting Trump and his allies and relying on sweeping executive actions. They also create an environment that encourages violence against the right. Vice President J.D. Vance summed it up succinctly on Wednesday. "If you want to stop political violence," he said, "stop telling your supporters that everybody who disagrees with you is a Nazi." It is possible to observe the trajectory of Trump's second term without invoking the ghost of Hitler and Nazi Germany. The process of what's called democratic backsliding, a nation's move from democratic principles to authoritarian government, is as much a modern-day phenomenon as it is a relic of 1940s Europe. The Varieties of Democracy Institute conducts an annual survey of the state of government around the globe. It found that 72% of the world's population now lives in autocracies. In 2024, 45 countries were moving toward more autocratic government in places like Hungary, Turkey, Mexico, Greece, and Ghana. In these nations, the patterns were similar. Erosions in freedom of speech, open elections, the rule of law, judicial independence, civil society, and academic freedom. Governments expanded their power over institutions and individuals. And, according to the Institute, the U.S. has been demonstrating similar, concerning trends. A common refrain I'd hear from Joe Biden as I covered him over the 4 years of his presidency was that this was a pivotal moment in world history, the culmination of a defining fight between democratic and authoritarian nations. By contrast, at the UN on Tuesday, Donald Trump said uncontrolled migration was the biggest political issue of our time. Listen to this American president and his supporters explain it, and all his moves over the past year have been necessary to secure America's future at home and abroad. The central struggle, in Trump's view, isn't between democracy and authoritarianism. It's between Western civilization and the forces that would destroy it. It was a common theme last Sunday when key members of the Trump administration gathered to honor Charlie Kirk at a raucous event in Arizona that was as much a political rally as it was a memorial service. "You have no idea how determined we will be to save this civilization, to save the West, to save this republic," said Stephen Miller, a White House advisor, in a fiery speech. I've covered American politics for a long time, but I think everyone in this nation, on the left and the right, feels like this is a moment of high import. Some may see it as one of particular opportunity. For others, however, it is a time of unique peril.
Anthony Zaka. Next to Brazil, which has had tense relations of its own with President Trump in recent months, be it over trade tariffs or the trial of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who was recently convicted of plotting a military coup. While the far-right leader now faces a 27-year prison sentence, he still has a faithful following. This could pose problems for current leader Lula da Silva as he contemplates a re-election run next year. Irony Wells recently met the president in the capital.
Imagine a presidential election where the incumbent left-leaning president would be in his 80s if he won again. Right-wing populists plan to take him on, furiously claiming their hero has been persecuted by the country's legal establishment. No, this is not a rerun of the US election of last year, but it could be Brazil next year. The presidential residence in Brasilia, where I went to meet the current president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is a modernist masterpiece. Its glass facade reflects the immaculate front lawn and swimming pool. Its design mirrors that of the Supreme Court and the presidential palace, all laid out by the left-wing architect Oscar Niemeyer in the 1950s and 60s, before he fled Brazil's right-wing military dictatorship, which had taken power following a coup. After President Lula took office in January 2023, the Supreme Court, the presidential palace and Congress were violently smashed into by a mob of supporters of his right-wing predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. I met President Lula nearly a week after Mr. Bolsonaro had been sentenced to 27 years in prison for masterminding a coup attempt of his own. He was accused, among other things, of knowing of a plot to assassinate President Lula. Lula, as he's known here, admitted he was frightened. I thought we had defeated the idea of coup attempts in Brazil, and suddenly a citizen thinks he has the right to discredit everything that we consider normal, he said, visibly angry. He was most fiery when he spoke about democracy, slamming the United Nations for excluding countries like Brazil from its key decision-making body, incensed when he spoke of Donald Trump imposing 50% tariffs on Brazil in response to Mr. Bolsonaro's trial. Lula now casts himself, along with the Supreme Court judges who assessed Bolsonaro's case, as a champion of democracy. The problem is, so do his opponents. An ideological battle is raging in Brazil over what democracy means, in a country where it was only restored in 1985. The Supreme Court here has granted itself sweeping powers. Judges are appointed by politicians but can also investigate them and strike down laws. It has carried out arrests and taken down social media accounts in a crackdown on fake news. At Bolsonarista rallies over the last few weeks, people kept telling me the same thing. This trial was a stitch-up. Brazil's left and Lula's government argued the trial was necessary to show that coup attempts and spreading misinformation are not acceptable. This deep division is setting the scene for another polarising election next October. I asked President Lula repeatedly if he has tried to call Donald Trump to talk about the tariffs he imposed on Brazil. They don't want to talk, he told me. This plays well to Lula's base. There has been a surge of patriotism on the left who see Trump's tariffs as bullying, and polls suggest Lula's defiance is boosting his popularity. His critics, though, think it irresponsible he has not even tried to forge some kind of relationship with his powerful northern neighbour. On the left, some privately hope that Donald Trump's tariffs could shore up support for Lula, not least if they hit farmers and producers in some of Bolsonaro's former strongholds. But a year is a long time in politics, and it is not just the right who are grumbling at Lula. Some on the left feel betrayed by his stance on the environment. While deforestation in the Amazon did fall when he took office, he is supportive of plans for oil companies to drill in the mouth of the Amazon River. When I challenged him on this, he became defensive. I want to know if any country on the planet that wants an energy transition is capable of giving up fossil fuels, he argued. Jair Bolsonaro's hopes of running for re-election have been dashed by his conviction. But some members of Congress, where his party still has a majority, are trying to grant him amnesty. One of Lula's potential opponents next year, the governor of Sao Paulo, has also pledged that if he's elected, he'd enable this. Bolsonaro remains influential. His backing could turbocharge any right-wing candidate. Some speculate one of his sons or his wife might run. Trying to win over more conservative or moderate voters while keeping hold of his base on the left is not an easy balancing act for Lula. Turning 80 next month, he's had some health setbacks and has not been blessed with the lucrative oil and commodity boom that funded massive social programmes in his first 2 terms in the 2000s. So, will he run again? He hasn't decided, he told me. His health and party will determine that. And, he added, if it would be politically convenient. It will also depend on whether he believes he would win the election, he said. In a country as polarised as Brazil, that feels incredibly tough to predict.
Irony Wells.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to the South Korean capital, Seoul, where authorities have launched a 5-year initiative aimed at tackling a growing loneliness epidemic. Once a deeply communal society where family ties were paramount, the country has been reckoning with the quickly rising number of people living alone. Initiatives include a telephone hotline, rewards for participating in social activities, and a cluster of new community centres designed in the style of the city's ubiquitous convenience stores. Jake Kwan paid a visit.
When Hee-kyung first came to Seoul's new convenience store-themed social space, she was very quiet, like many others at their first visit. The 29-year-old barely spoke to any of the social workers and counselors inside. Nothing like when I met her at the store. A stocky young woman with a thick pair of glasses. She approached me first, excited to make a new friend. She's exactly the type of person this space was meant for. She's estranged from her mother and has no job. She has no family or friends to talk to. Hee-kyung only leaves the house to pop into fast food restaurants. Otherwise, she spends most of her day lying on the floor watching cute animal videos on her phone. She's been living alone for 7 years. On her first day at the convenience store, she went in out of curiosity. This social space was filled with items to make sure people visit and come back again, like stacks of free ramen noodles and an automatic massage chair. The light wood panel walls and beanbag chairs made it look like halfway between a cafe and a nursery. This initiative began after a 2022 survey found that the share of single-person households in the city had reached nearly 40%, and estimated that more than 13% of the city's 10 million residents are socially isolated. Another nationwide survey the following year found that a third of adults have either no one to ask for help with housework or speak to when they're feeling sad. Until a generation ago, Korean people lived in large families. They also had tight communities. A common saying went that people knew how many spoons their neighbors had. But with the stunning economic success came the Western lifestyle. It became common for families to live separately, for the children to move to big cities for work or for school, and for couples to divorce. It's now hard to imagine how people lived before. Then came the series of lonely deaths, or in Korean, kodoksa, where people die in isolation and their bodies are discovered days or weeks later. It was seen as a failure of society. The number of single-person households was also sharply rising. The city government initially began reaching out to people who are shut in. Now it's gone even further to address the isolation and opened 4 of what they're calling warm-hearted convenience stores in March. The branch I visited in Seoul's northeastern district of Dongdaemun was picked for its proximity to many low-income housing, where residents live in tiny subdivided apartments alone. Outside the store, I ran into a man who has been coming every week for movies and coffee. When I asked him whether he has friends or family, he looked pained. My mother had a stroke. I looked after her for 52 years. He told me he missed his chance at marriage and children, and I left all my friends, he added. I felt unwelcome in most places and didn't have money to go to movies or cafes, but coming here and seeing people, sharing my emotions, it feels good. It changes me. The store's manager, Lee Bo-hyun, told me that most visitors are unemployed people in their middle age. They have been isolated for weeks and months, and in some cases, years. The first step is to get them to feel comfortable just sitting next to someone else, he said. The stores have been a hit. The city expected to see 5,000 visits this year, but have had nearly 20,000 visits in only 4 months. The store counselor Lee In-suk says hello to 70 to 80 people coming to the store each day. She knows loneliness. She divorced 10 years ago, and her 2 children moved out in the past years. She said she sees herself in the visitors. She recalled meeting Hee-kyung. She immediately caught her eye because she is around the same age as her daughter. Though they barely spoke on the first day, and she looked uncomfortable, she came back, again, and again, and again. Today, Hee-kyung is the store's most loyal guest. She's here almost every day, chatting with others. I escape loneliness each day I am here, she said. The store gave me new friends.
Jake Kwan. And finally, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia was banned from participating in the Eurovision Song Contest. In response, President Putin decided to revive the Soviet-era Songfest, Intervision. This year's competition had 23 countries taking part, including Russian allies from Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America. The result? Less kitsch, more Kremlin. Steve Rosenberg was in Moscow for the final.
I suppose it's inevitable. Whenever you bring a bunch of countries together to compete at anything, there will always be an element of politics, whether it's the Football World Cup, international chess, or the Eurovision Song Contest. But the Intervision Song Contest takes that to a whole new level. Politics here is centre stage. I take my seat in the concert hall and the show begins, not with a pop singer, but the president. Vladimir Putin appears on a giant video screen and waxes lyrical about this Soviet-era songfest, Russia's rival to Eurovision, which he revived by presidential decree. The Kremlin leader calls for cultural dialogue, international friendship and mutual respect. Laudable objectives for sure, except this is the same Vladimir Putin who ordered the full-scale invasion of Russia's neighbour, and whose army continues to attack Ukrainian towns and cities. International friendship, it seems, has limits. Minutes later, the hosts are interviewing the deputy chairman of the Intervision Advisory Board, none other than Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Intervision is a Russian government project. Banned from Eurovision over its war in Ukraine, Russia has gone ahead and organised an international song contest it can take part in. And to ensure success, it has spent a lot of money. The result is a spectacular 4-hour show that looks, well, just like the Eurovision Song Contest, actually, from the structure of the competition to the staging and even the awkward interviews with singers in the green room. Except for the countries taking part, Russia's global friends and allies, like China, India, Venezuela, Qatar and Madagascar. One other noticeable difference: no rainbow flags or LGBTQ themes, as you might see at the Eurovision Song Contest, which has become a showcase for inclusivity and diversity. Intervision emphasises so-called traditional values and cultural identity. Representing Russia is pro-Putin pop star Yaroslav Dronov, stage name Shaman, who is currently under EU sanctions over the war in Ukraine. Shortly after the full-scale invasion, he released a patriotic number entitled I Am Russian, with this chorus: I am Russian, I go to the end. I am Russian, to spite the world. Before the contest begins, excited young Shaman fans with Russian flags are running through the foyer performing I Am Russian for the TV cameras. Then a Russian TV crew comes up to me. Are they showing Intervision in the UK? The reporter asks. No, I reply. The United Kingdom isn't taking part. Regretfully, the reporter adds, nodding and smiling as if she hopes that I will concur. I avoid the trap and simply reply that I'm a big fan of Eurovision. Later, on social media, I read this. The BBC's Steve Rosenberg tells Channel 1 he regrets that the UK isn't in Intervision. The only thing I regret is talking to Russian TV. The organisers did make one attempt to get Britain involved. A few days before the contest, I went to an Intervision press conference. It was given by a senior Kremlin official, the Foreign Minister, and a Deputy Prime Minister, just in case you had any doubts about the politics of the thing. The head of Russian TV was there too, and addressed me. Eurovision restricted our participation in their competition, said Channel 1 Russia CEO Konstantin Ernst. But if the UK wishes to take part in Intervision, we'd welcome this. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dmitry Chernyshenko, looked at me. Can you sing? He asked. I didn't respond, in words or music. America agreed to sing at Intervision. However, with just days to go before the contest, the US entrant withdrew for family reasons. His replacement, an Australian singer, pulled out too at the very last minute. the result of political pressure, growled Russia. In the end, it was Vietnamese artist FOOC who lifted the glass trophy. He's a huge star at home after winning the Vietnamese edition of The Voice. Interestingly, one of his most viral music videos contains images of two men expressing their love for each other. Not exactly Intervision friendly. Even so, the Russian authorities are hailing Intervision as a big success and a refreshing alternative to Eurovision, which makes the end of the show such a curious one. All the artists gather on the Intervision stage and join together in music. And what song do they sing? The title is A Million Voices. It's from 2015, and it was Russia's entry at Eurovision.
Steve Rosenberg, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Please join us then.
Hello, I'm Amol Rajan, and from BBC Radio 4, this is Radical. We are living through one of those hinge moments in history when all the old certainties crumble and a new world struggles to be born. So the idea behind this podcast is to help you navigate it.
What's really changed is the volume of information. That has exploded.
And also by offering a safe space for the radical ideas that our future demands.
Go to the Chancellor and say, radically cut the taxes of those with children.
Telling our stories is powerful and a radical act.
Listen to Radical with Amol Rajan on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Afghanistan, where we hear how life has changed for two women since the Taliban returned to power 4 years ago. In Beijing, a human rights lawyer, once imprisoned for subversion of the state, tells of the civilian spies employed to keep tabs on him. On the 80th anniversary of VJ Day, we reflect on how the Second World War is remembered in Japan. And finally, we're in Tajikistan, on the trail of the maligned and misunderstood striped hyena. But first to Ghor in Afghanistan, a province with unforgiving terrain and crumbling roads, to a small maternity hospital where 2 female doctors serve thousands of patients. With limited resources and financial support, the odds are stacked against them and against the women they treat. According to the United Nations, Afghanistan has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, a figure that could rise as international aid shrinks and as the Taliban continues to impose restrictions on NGOs that employ women. Mahjouba Naurouzi reports from Gore.
The hospital in Firuzkoh is a pale, unassuming building set within a spacious compound lined with green pine trees, fruit trees and flowering shrubs. And it is a lifeline for thousands in this remote part of central Afghanistan. Women often travel for hours across rough terrain to reach it. Resources are scarce, but the need is constant. Firuzkoh is the capital town of Ghor province. It's a place of faded grandeur. Once a centre of Islamic art, it is now mostly made up of mud brick homes and crumbling buildings, shaped by resilience and long winters. Inside the hospital, the maternity wing is bustling with women and children. Men are not allowed inside. They wait in the courtyard outside, sitting on benches in the sun for hours, clutching plastic bags of medicine or folded shawls. Inside the hospital, the pace is relentless. I met Dr. Khatara just before 11 a.m. She had already seen dozens of patients. Her voice was low, but steady. Her face concealed behind a black face mask. She is the head of the maternity ward. Dr. Khatara also wears a black headscarf and a threadbare white doctor's coat over her shalwar kameez. There are only 2 female gynecologists working at this main hospital, Dr. Khatara and Dr. Nasreen Lalzad. They are both in their early 30s and have started working in the hospital in the last 3 to 4 years. There are days we work 24/7, Nasreen told me. We see 50 to 60 women a day, and still it's not enough. This is the only maternity hospital in the province, but a place that's meant to bring life into the world is now a witness to frequent tragedy. An average of 2 mothers and 3 babies die at this hospital every month, higher than elsewhere in Afghanistan. A man with a black beard and dark turban stood silently near the maternity ward entrance. He told me his wife had given birth that day. Their baby had died. "We came too late," said the father of 6. The midwives tried everything, but there was no oxygen left. They had to borrow from other patients. By the time it came, my baby was gone, he said. The doctors here see this every week. Some women go into labor at home, and it can take up to 15 hours before they reach the hospital. By then, it's often too late. Inside the ward, the paint was peeling off the walls. There were stained mattresses, cracked tiles. Medicine is scarce. Even basic supplies like gloves and syringes must be bought by the patients, if they can afford them. I have to write a prescription just for gloves so I can carry out a vaginal examination, Dr. Nasreen told me, without emotion. It's just the way it is, another fact of life, added to a long list of day-to-day struggles. Since the Taliban took back control of the country in 2021, many NGOs have pulled out of Afghanistan. The few that remain focus on providing food and helping in emergencies. Routine healthcare, especially women's healthcare, has been left behind. The Ministry of Public Health advertises vacancies for female specialists, but in remote provinces like Ghor, no one applies. 13 posts at this hospital remain vacant. There is already a severe shortage of female doctors here, which is likely to get worse due to Taliban restrictions on women's education and training in fields like midwifery and nursing. We don't even have housing for female doctors, one administrator admitted, and many won't come here without male guardians. I watched Dr. Khatara move from bed to bed, checking charts, whispering reassurances. There was no break, no respite. In a country where women often avoid male doctors, these 2 women are constantly on call, even through the night. As I left, Dr. Khatara caught my eye again and offered a brief smile. Sometimes, she says, I wonder how long we can keep going like this. Outside, the wind had picked up. A woman sat behind her husband on a motorbike, holding a small bundle. Whether it was a newborn or a body, I couldn't tell. In Ghor, life and death ride side by side, and in the silence between them, two doctors fight for time.
Mahjouba Nawrouzi. Last year, BBC Radio 4's Crossing Continents aired the award-winning documentary Our Whole Life is a Secret, which charted the life of a young Afghan woman who we're calling Layla. Her audio diaries, which were voiced by an actor, revealed the myriad ways the Taliban has increasingly curtailed the personal freedoms of Afghan women. It's not just dictating how they dress or restricting education. Women are now also forbidden to sing together or raise their voices in prayer. This next dispatch is an update from Layla, in which she paints a picture of her life today, 4 years after the Taliban returned to power. Once again, her words are voiced by an actor.
In our alley, the winds blow wild and harsh. The ground isn't paved, so the dust spins in the air, dancing violently with each gust. The midday sun scorches the earth these burning hot August days. Everyone stays indoors, and it's more like a ghost alley. Before the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan 4 years ago, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread used to drift through our alley too. It came from the house of Mariam, our neighbour. It's not her real name because I have to hide her identity, and mine, and I can't tell you where we live. Mariam filled our neighbourhood with the scent of bread from her tandoor. That's an oven made of clay. Sometimes, out of kindness, she'd send warm loaves to her neighbours like us. Only one house stood between hers and ours, and we still smelt the bread as the Taliban drew near and the battle for power in our city began, through explosions and blood and fear. That was a suffocating, terrible August. Mariam was middle-aged, with wide eyes and a high forehead. She was widowed in the war before I was born, and was the only breadwinner in our home. 1, 2, 3 of her children were born sickly, all of them boys. But then came Setare, a healthy girl. That's not her real name, of course. The neighbours would whisper, if only it had been the boys who'd been born strong and able, because to them a girl brings no luck to the house. Setare wanted to play with us in the street, but she had to do housework while her mother worked, running a small beauty salon in the corner of her home. Their house had a special smell of its own, of hairspray, lipstick, facial creams and henna, and it carried a spirit of freedom. The air there always buzzed with forbidden laughter, the chatter of women, the joy of young girls who came to be made beautiful. One wanted thin eyebrows. One wanted her hair curled with damp wooden sticks. Another asked for henna patterns on her hands. Before starting her work, Mariam would tie her golden hair up in a knot and remove her fake nails for ease. She connected her phone to a speaker, and loud Indian music would fill the room. She loved those songs. The walls of her salon were covered with pictures of Bollywood stars like Shah Rukh Khan. Mariam's hands moved through the girl's hair, braiding strands, weaving in hope. To us, she was the woman whose house was a place where women could raise their voices, where music could be loud. And Setare, she would sit on a stool, book in hand, studying, her mother's shining star. She was going to become a doctor, and she did so well that she was accepted into medical school. A widow's daughter. She enrolled and was looking forward to first year. She was starting to fly. Then came the Taliban, and all those futures stopped for both daughter and mother. No more university for girls. There were no more weddings, no more celebrations. No one came for henna anymore. No one wanted her hair braided. No more music to gladden the heart. The Taliban banned all pictures of living beings, spray painting them black across the city. Mariam closed the salon. She pulled the Bollywood posters from her walls, one by one, and burned them in the yard. Setare bundled her anatomy, physiology, and pathology books and packed them away in a sack. I don't think she could bear to look at them again. Afghan society reminded her for the 1000th time, women can't become doctors, don't even dream. She told me, even if universities were to reopen, I'll never dare to hope again. But we all have to eat, and this was a family of 5. Mariam, the woman who once built her world with scissors and comb, taught herself how to make designs in enamel and decorate plates and vases, in secret of course. And Setare learned to help her. And then they found a woman with a smartphone who could advertise their beautiful creations, also in secret. And so through their creativity and ingenuity, they are surviving, just about. The stool where Setare sat and studied all those years is empty. Mariam doesn't have time or money now to bake bread for the neighbors. These hot August days, our alley smells only of dust.
The words of Layla, a young woman in Afghanistan, and you can hear Our Whole Life is a Secret on Crossing Continents on BBC Sounds. Next to China, where pro-democracy campaigners regularly face surveillance and restrictions on their movement. Among those under scrutiny are several human rights lawyers, including Wang Chanjung, who's defended clients in several politically sensitive cases against the Chinese government. In 2015, he was arrested alongside other lawyers and activists in what was known as the 709 crackdown, and was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for subverting state power. Since his release, he's been living in Beijing and told the BBC's Danny Vincent about his life since leaving prison.
Outside Wang Chanjung's home in Beijing, a group of men keep watch. He believes up to 10 men are assigned to follow him daily. The unidentified men trace Wang's every move. They sit and stand outside the doorway of his apartment block, day and night. I see no legal basis for their surveillance, the debarred human rights lawyer tells me in a video call from his apartment in the city's eastern suburbs. On his desk lie legal documents and a laptop with which he communicates with the outside world. The men follow and film his every move. At times he confronts them. They film him. He films them back. It offers a rare window into the levels of scrutiny activists in China face. For 2 years I've been speaking to Wang Chanjung over encrypted social media apps from our office in Hong Kong. He's been sending me footage of his surveillance. It's better to report it than not to report it, he tells me, as I ask if he's concerned for his safety. Men follow him on the streets as he takes video selfies. He stops, they stop. He walks, they walk. In 2013, he was held in incommunicado for more than 1,000 days before being imprisoned for 4.5 years for subversion of the state. 5 years after his release, he remains under close surveillance. China uses a sophisticated system to monitor its citizens these days. It combines AI-powered cameras with facial recognition technology. All internet users must register their social media accounts with the government using their real names. Activists like Wang can be monitored electronically in real time. China under Xi Jinping has also seen an ideological shift. Legal activists say China is witnessing a revival of a Mao-era style of surveillance, known as the Feng Xiao experience. Under Chairman Mao, local officials encouraged citizens to monitor and report on class enemies, capitalists, and counter-revolutionaries. In recent years, Chinese President Xi Jinping has publicly praised this form of social governance, which encourages would-be informants. Human rights lawyers like Wang say it's this type of civilian-led surveillance that's being used across China. The unidentified men following him claim to be enthusiastic citizens, but Wang believes they're paid by the local police. The Chinese authorities have not responded to requests from the BBC for a comment. As a human rights lawyer, Wang hopes to hold the authorities to account. There is no provision in Chinese law that allows this to happen to a citizen or a human rights lawyer, especially one who was released from prison after being persecuted in an unfair trial, he said. The government doesn't admit they have me under surveillance. The people monitoring me don't admit they're from the government, Wang adds. In 2015, hundreds of human rights lawyers and legal activists were arrested in a nationwide crackdown known as the 709 incident. 10 years on, the plight of legal activism has become a footnote in the wider story of China's global ambition. Lawyers have been disappeared, detained, and disbarred. The rise of human rights lawyering in the 90s and 2000s was one of China's tremendous success stories. The state's response was wildly disproportionate, Sophie Richardson, a human rights activist in the US, tells me. The fact they were taking these ideas out to larger communities of lawyers and to different kinds of networks was as meaningful to them as actually trying to secure victories in court, she says. In 2023, Wang tells me he was forced to move home 13 times in the space of 2 months. Landlords intimidated by local authorities were pressured to evict him or refuse to rent to him and his family. Earlier this year, his wife and child were stopped from leaving the country. They were told there were threats to national security. He says his 13-year-old son has been unable to attend school in Beijing due to constant harassment. The treatment of rights lawyers like Wang raised questions about China's commitment to the rule of law and to an international rules-based system. Fellow activists and supporters like Su Nan say informal surveillance gives the authorities a level of deniability. They're using the least political cost to limit his influence, she says, and they're setting an example by punishing his disobedience to intimidate those around him.
Danny Vincent.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
It's 80 years ago this week that Japan's Emperor Hirohito surrendered to Allied forces in World War II, bringing an end to the 6-year-long conflict. His surrender came after the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing more than 200,000 people. On a recent visit to Hiroshima, Ellie House encountered a group of schoolchildren in the city's Peace Park and discovered more about how this period of history is remembered there.
How does the Peace Memorial Park make you feel? Asked a little girl on a school trip. It was a humid day in Hiroshima, and I was sat cross-legged on a bench, resting in the lush green park in the city centre. Next to me was a thick concrete archway, and if you looked through it at the right angle, you had a clear view of the atomic bomb dome, the haunting skeleton of a pre-war building, one of only a few left standing after the bombing of Hiroshima in August 1945. The little girl was in one of several groups of Japanese schoolchildren who approached me in the park, each grasping an A4 sheet of paper, tasked with finding English speakers with whom to practice their language skills. When she asked how the park made me feel, I was presented with 8 options, including words like peaceful, happy, or harmony. None of them described what I was actually feeling as I sat reflecting on the horrors wrought by the atomic bombs, which finally brought to an end the Second World War 80 years ago. I selected peaceful, and the children diligently filled in their worksheets and went on their way. This eerie juxtaposition came to define Hiroshima for me. The blooming summer park in the middle of a thriving city was filled with memories from one of the most destructive episodes in history. It's a memorial for a war in which millions of Japanese people died, and a war in which Japanese soldiers committed well-documented atrocities. But to me, the public framing of this memorial felt sanitised. There's rarely any mention of war. It's all about peace. I'm a prisoner of memories now, says Yoshikuni Igarashi, a history professor at Vanderbilt University. He researches the way that his home country, Japan, has carved out its narrative of the war. Soon after its surrender, and under occupation by US and Allied forces, Japan became a pacifist nation. Yoshi says the most fundamental decision that the Japanese authority made was accepting the hegemony of the former enemy United States. There's a strikingly passive framing to the way these events are discussed in Japan. August 15th, the day Japan surrendered, is known as Shusen no Hi, which Yoshi translates as the day war ended. He says this choice of terminology, rather than the alternative Haisen no Hi, meaning day of defeat, tells us a lot about Japanese memory of the war, as if this is a natural disaster, Yoshi says. Just days before my visit to Hiroshima, I'd been in a coastal town in the north of Japan, which had sustained extensive damage during the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. I visited a museum there dedicated to the effects of the destructive tidal wave. And walking around the Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, it felt unusually similar. As I made my way through the dark halls, I saw pictures of corpses clogging up the rivers, fragments of a white wall streaked with black rain, and hundreds of drawings by survivors depicting flames, mushroom clouds, the dead and injured. But I didn't notice any mention of the context of these horrors, the Second World War, until the very end of my tour, almost as if it were an afterthought. This isn't unusual, I was told by a friend who worked as an assistant language teacher in a Japanese school. She told me about one of the storybooks a class of teenagers had to read as part of their English studies. Once upon a time, a big old tree stands by a road near the city of Hiroshima. Through the years, it has seen many things. In the story, the tree goes on to tell its worst memory. A big bomb fell on the city of Hiroshima. Many people lost their lives. When the class was discussing the story, my friend recalled the teacher in charge simply remarked, "What a sad accident." The fact Japan was at war at the time, and the decision-making that led to the bombing, were conspicuously absent. I think Japan is still negotiating the difficult tension in its war memories, says historian Yoshi Igarashi. Here, as in all countries, history is political. There's this nationalist discourse, he tells me, which characterises Japan's war as the effort to liberate Asian nations from European colonialism. It does not commemorate defeat, only the sacrifices of the fallen soldiers. Meanwhile, liberals in Japan see Japan's war as a colonial enterprise, Yoshi goes on. It invaded countries across the region, like China, Singapore, and Burma, now Myanmar, and committed widely documented atrocities. They're always contesting in the public sphere who has a better understanding of history, he adds. Speaking to people about the ways the war has been remembered in Japan and elsewhere, I'm reminded that history is never static.
Ellie House. And finally to the sun-baked mountains of Tajikistan, where the endangered striped hyena is fighting for survival. Scientists say we're now living through the sixth mass extinction, one that's largely driven by human activity. But Tajik conservationists have been working hard to save this elusive and much misunderstood animal. Antonia Bolingbroke-Kent went to meet them.
It was here. This is where I first saw one. Ismail Kolmatov, a wildlife biologist from the Tajikistan Nature Foundation, was standing beside a small algae-filled pool at the top of a stony canyon. The pool didn't look like much, but in 2017, after years of searching, a striped hyena, an animal long thought extinct in Tajikistan, appeared on a camera trap Ismail had set here. "It was a miracle," said Ismail, his boyish face lighting up at the memory. There are as few as 5,000 striped hyenas left worldwide, scattered across North Africa, the Middle East, India and Central Asia. Unlike the spotted hyena, famous for its cackling bark, this striped variety is solitary and much less vocal. Hoping to see one of these shy, persecuted animals, Ismail and I had come to a low fold of mountains near the Afghan and Uzbek borders. For 4 days we bumped along dirt tracks in Ismail's truck, dust and locust swarms billowing in our wake. Never have I been anywhere so parched, so scored by bone-dry riverbeds. The story of the striped hyena's decline here, at the northeastern tip of its range, is closely entwined with Tajikistan's recent history. First came collectivization, the Soviets transforming these once forested hills into intensively cultivated farms, with hyenas, Persian leopards, wolves, and even the last Caspian tigers hunted as pests. Then came the civil war of the 90s and a proliferation of guns. There was no control anymore, said Nazar, an old forester I met. People arrived with Kalashnikovs and shot everything. No one could stop them. A wiry old man sporting a steel grey moustache and traditional Toki hat, Nazar lived, along with his extended family, in a compound of low mud brick houses where donkeys lay in pools of shade and chickens scratched at the dust. Like everyone I spoke with here, Nazar said how much hotter the area had become in his lifetime, how it no longer snowed in winter, how the rivers had disappeared. Garam, he kept saying, hot. With no wilderness and little natural prey remaining, hyenas have become forced to resort to the occasional theft of sheep and goats. At a livestock market south of the capital, Dushanbe, Alim, an ethnic Uzbek shepherd with a wide gold-toothed smile, told me he'd seen a hyena take one of his lambs. They're pests, he said. No one likes them. Another man claimed a hyena had broken into his corral and killed dozens of sheep. Something biologist Ismail said a hyena would never do. They get blamed for a lot of crimes they don't commit, he said sadly. At times, with so much against the hyena and so few people who care, Ismail had almost given up hope that they could survive. Shepherds hate them, hunters shoot them on sight, people block and set fire to their dens. And then there are the folk beliefs. Striped hyena body parts have been used as charms and medicines for centuries, with spells and beliefs carried along the veins of the old Silk Road. Until the late 90s, in neighbouring Afghanistan, some mullahs would wear a hyena's vulva under their armpit. It was said that any man who looked through it at the woman he desired would win her affection. While these old folk practices may have died out, striped hyena parts are still widely available online. The poor, persecuted hyena, seen as both a curse and a blessing, though in each case to its own detriment. The irony is that hyenas actually are good for our health, but not when dried and bottled. Hyenas eat dead animals and clean the environment, Ismail told me, as we sheltered from the sun under a pistachio tree one afternoon. Without such scavengers, infectious microorganisms and zoonotic diseases would spread more widely. The hyena's stomach is like an acid bath, he explained, killing dangerous bacteria and preventing the spread of disease. Despite everything, Ismail is determined to carry on helping these animals. To carry on working, carry on researching, he said. We must never give up hope.
Antonia Bolingbroke-Kent. And that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Tim Hayward, presenter of The Trip, coming soon to BBC Radio 4's Understand feed. Psychedelics, a category of drugs that induce altered states, are having something of a moment. Over 10 episodes, I'll be diving deep into a rapidly evolving landscape, from an inflatable head to the glands of a particular toad, from the past and into the future. I'll be asking, what does it all mean? That's The Trip, with me, Tim Hayward. Listen first on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's backed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.